going back to Luke 22 and 30, he says that what? Let's start at 28. Ye are they which have continued with me in my temptations, and I appoint unto you a kingdom as my Father hath appointed unto me, that ye may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom and sit on thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. When you look up this word for table, all right, we're going to sit directly at the table with Yahweh Shai, judging the matters of the whole entire planet Earth. Okay, the word table is trapeza. Trapeza, a table on which food is placed, an eating place. Now we know that we're going to eat and drink with him, but more importantly, this table symbolizes the table in which the priest sat, handling the affairs of the nation of Israel, taking in all of the increase, the goods, the first fruits that will come to the temple would all be given unto the priest. So it says the table in the temple at Jerusalem, on which the consecrated loaves were placed, right? And it says the table or stand of a money changer, where he sits exchanging different kinds of money for a fee and paying back with loans or deposits. Now, when we go to the book of Deuteronomy, the 28th chapter and the 12th verse, now remember, these are the blessings. We got to remember to tap into these blessings. Yeah, we know the curses are from Deuteronomy 28:15 on down, but when you read the blessings, you get insight into what we are getting ready to inherit. Now, one of the things that Yahweh Shai said that we just read is that he had his soul with him, judging the affairs of the 12 tribes of Israel, setting everything in order, being at the forefront, all right, of establishing forever X. Deuteronomy 28:12, Yahweh shall open unto thee his good treasure, the heaven to give the rain unto thy land in his seasons, and everything is going to flourish, everything is going to be on point, won't be any drought, right? The seasons are going to come in perfection, everything will flourish, no GMOs, right? And to bless all the work of thy hand, and thou shalt lend unto many nations, and thou shalt not borrow. Read that in the NLT. It says you will lend to many nations, but you will never need to borrow from them. So when you understand the kingdom of heaven and being a priest after the order of Melchizedek, which is Yahweh Shai, we are going to be the bankers of the nation of Israel. We're going to be the bankers of the whole world. But see, we're going to deal in righteousness. Lend to heathen, deny loans, will be at the forefront of how everything flows throughout the whole four corners of the earth. The Lord shall make thee the head and not the tail, and thou shalt be above only, and thou shalt be beneath. See, and this is what's promised unto us under Yahweh Shai's kingdom. Joint heirs of what? Being at the forefront of creation. Being at the forefront of setting everything back in its proper perspective, putting everything where it needs to be. All right, from trees to, everything that you can imagine. And we're going to do this in new bodies.
All right, Shalom. First and foremost, I would like to give all praise and glory unto Yahweh Bahashem, Yahweh Shai Bahashem, Rakakwadash, and double honors unto the apostles and the elders of GMS who rule well, teach well, being great examples towards younger brothers And peace and blessings and salutation to the hopeful lake out there pushing his word and truth and this sincerity across the four winds in the name of Yahweh Bahashem, Yahweh Shah Bahashem Rakakwadash, pushing to get up out of here. Shalom to the hopeful lake, the believers, the listeners whom have came back to the obedience of the scriptures through faith in Yahweh Bahashem Yahweh Shah. And I want to get into with this lesson, all right, this morning, dealing with the conquest of the wicked, okay? Because to understand, the end, to really understand, all right, prophecy, well, we have to understand the stories of Jacob and Esau, okay, and understand, the nations that will come from these two men and how, the affairs of the world and prophecy, revolve around these two nations of people, okay, because even when you go here, let's get this in the book of, let's get this in the book of, I believe that's Hebrews, all right, so let's go here to the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, okay, and the spirit been having this come out lately because we're at the end of Esau's kingdom and the beginning of Jacob's. So the scriptures, been heavy, dealing with, the narrative of Jacob and Esau. You know, and when you go into Hebrews 11:20, it says, "By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come." Okay, so even when you get into the book of Hebrews, all right, the narrative of Jacob and Esau is still relevant. Okay, because major prophecy will play out concerning these two nations of people. You see, and when you go into the the book of Genesis 27, all right, there's only two nations of people that was promised the fatness of the earth. Okay, now when you go into the book of Genesis 27 and 27, this is Jacob being blessed, and he came near and kissed him, and they're being blessed by Isaac. And he smelled the smell of his raiment and blessed him and said, "See, the smell of my son is as the smell of the field which the Lord had blessed." Okay, so this is Jacob, getting ready to be blessed. Now he supplanted. It was set up with Rebecca, aiding him in supplanting the blessing from Esau, but it was always Jacob's blessing in the spirit. That's why it wasn't reversed. All right, Jacob wasn't rebuked. Okay, matter of fact, the Lord doubled down. Isaac doubled down on the blessing given to Jacob. Okay, it says therefore the Most High give thee the dew of heaven and the fatness of earth and plenty of corn and wine. All right, and that's the resources, man. The fatness of the earth. All right, there's control of the resources of the earth. There's wealth, abundance. You see, he said, "Let people serve thee." Yeah, these nations. Okay, that was a part of our blessing. That's why Psalms 2 asking me, and I shall give thee the heathen, okay, for a possession in the uttermost parts of the earth for an inheritance, man. Okay, roughly paraphrasing, but that's part of our inheritance as the sons of God, this nation serving us, man. Okay, but going through this captivity to learn righteousness first. Okay, it says the nations bow down to thee, be Lord over thy brethren, and let thy mother's son bow down to thee, which that's Esau. Cursed be everyone that cursed thee, and blessed be he that blessed thee. And it shall come to pass as soon as Isaac had made an end of blessing Jacob, all right, and Jacob was yet scarce gone out from the presence of Isaac his father, that Esau his brother came in from hunting. So Jacob was given, everything, and Jacob's blessing is eternal. Jacob's blessing is eternal. And that's why, Jacob didn't have to be blessed with the sword, because we're not going to have to use the sword to maintain our kingdom. When Yahweh Shah come and wages war and righteousness, the nations will learn war anymore. Okay, well that's another topic. The nations shall not learn war anymore. All right, the nations will never have to learn war, man, because once we're getting power, man, that's it. Ain't no more wars, man. We're gonna rule with absolute power authority. Okay, we're not gonna need tanks, okay, fighter jets or standing military. Nah, man, we're gonna be gods in the earth, man. Okay, so when you go to jump down and get to the point, to the blessing of Esau, because I got a video I want to play and go with this. But when you go into the blessing of Esau, okay, his blessing is a little different. It's similar, but it's different. All right. This is Genesis 27 and 38. And Esau said to his father, "Hast thou but one blessing? My father, bless me, even me thy son." me also, O my father. And Esau lifted up his voice and wept. And Isaac his father answered and said unto him, Behold, thy dwelling shall be the fatness of the earth and the dew of heaven from above. All right, so Esau begged for a blessing, even though he sold his birthright, okay, and the blessing belonged to Jacob anyway, because the Lord calls Israel his firstborn. Okay, even though Esau was the firstborn carnally or spiritually, Jacob is the firstborn in the heavens. So the blessing was always his anyway. The blessing always belonged to the sons of God. All right, from Genesis, the Lord was dealing, with particular lineage, and Jacob is considered the son of God. Okay, they're blessed and chosen lineage, man. And Esau is an outcast; he's rejected. Okay, so he's blessed, begging for a blessing. Isaac, his father, answered and said unto him, Behold, thy dwelling shall be the fatness of the earth and of the dew of heaven from above. Okay, so he will be blessed, with the world, the earth, just as Jacob was blessed. Okay, but how will Esau get and maintain his blessings? And by the sword shalt thou live. Okay, and by the sword thou shalt live. So Esau will have to get his blessing through the sword, and he will have to maintain his blessing through the sword. Okay, everything he did will be by the sword. Okay, and he did in a very wicked, all right, in a deceitful way. You see, it says, and shall serve thy brother, and it shall come to pass when thou shalt have the dominion that thou shalt break his yoke from off thy neck. Okay, was you went over this, we had this devil, in captivity under King David, King Solomon. He broke away, and centuries later on down the line, it will eventually emerge, as the Greek Empire. Okay, then the Romans, and then they will fall. All right, and Jake will have the dominion, and Esau was, pushed to the side. Okay, he was on pretty much on the outskirts of society, what they call Eastern Europe today. Over there in Georgia, Russia, Ukraine area. The Caucasus Mountains. Okay, but then eventually he will wiggle his way back in power after 1,000 years because it was prophesied that Satan shall be loose. Okay, and this is he was prophesied with that thou shalt break his yoke from off thy neck. So this is devil. Okay, he's in his little season where he's off the chain. He's in his little season with his sword. Okay, so as we go from there, as we see it, Esau was blessed with the sword. Well, when you go to Revelation 6 and 4, what will he do with that sword? It says, and there went out another horse that was red, which represents Esau Edom. Because Edom out of woman in Hebrew was red. The nickname given to him by Jacob when he sold his birthright for that red pottage, that uncooked meat. Okay, and it says, and power was given to him that sat thereon to take peace from the earth. So with the sword, he would take peace from the earth. Okay, that would be a characteristic of his rulership, man. And you see that this man does nothing but bully with his sword. Okay, now he's at the end, okay, because the Lord is getting ready to end his rulership. So that sword ain't as effective as it used to be, man. All right, but in Esau's prime, he was nothing but a bully and a terror with that sword, man. And that's a characteristic of his rulership. It says, and that they should kill one another, and there was given unto him a great sword, and it said that they should kill one another. Because once these devils, conquered, the people of the earth, all right, they do what they always do. They turn the sword on each other, and that's why you had the World War I and World War II. It was Edomites fighting over power, okay, within their own kingdom, within their own empire, within their own empire, man. Okay, and now they're on the brink, to try to fight to establish a technocracy. You see, but you go from there. Let's go to the book of Job, chapter 9. All right, when you get the book of Job, chapter 9, in verse oh yeah, it's the book of Job, chapter 9, verse 24. You see, it says the earth is given into the hand of the wicked. Okay, now it doesn't put a name on who's the wicked, but there's a precept that does will get it. Okay, it said the earth is given into the hand of the wicked. He covered the faces of the judges thereof, is not where and who is he. Now, this what gives this devil away. Because who are the judges? Well, you got the Most High Judge, the Heavenly Father, Yahweh. All right, the God of the Bible, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay, and then you have his son, his only begotten, Yahweh Shai. Okay, and then you have the men of Israel. Those are the judges. Okay, those were those are the judges of existence, man. Beginning with the Most High, then Yahweh Shai, then the men of Israel. Okay, and what did this devil do? He painted his likeness, his image as the Most High, as the Messiah, as the true Israelites, as the prophets, the apostles. You know what nation of people did that and published it throughout the earth, man? All right, so-called white man, which who the wicked, which is who Esau, Edom. Okay, now when you go into the book of Malachi, it puts a name on who the wicked is, man. Okay, you see, and understanding, Jacob and Esau. Okay, we can understand prophecy, man. And then you can break down history by using the scripture because uh, history, a lot of the history is prophecy that already has passed, and that's why we're able to break down, history using the prophecies of the scriptures. Okay, because there's things that was once prophecies, but they're history now. You see, so we're able to explain certain history by going into what the prophecies, man. Okay, Malachi 1:4, where Edom said, "We are impoverished, but we will return and build the desolate places. Thus said the Lord of hosts, they shall build, but I will throw down." Okay, so they was impoverished when they fell as Western Rome. Okay, but it said, "But we will return and build the desolate place," and that was the Renaissance period, man. And that's when these European, all right, these because Jake, was the monarchs, okay, and the nobility of Europe during the Dark Ages. Okay, but when Esau would start to come back in power, he would take down Constantinople, the Ottoman Empire. Okay, they would take down Granada. All right, then you had King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, begin to take over Spain and Portuguese, which that was all Jake at one time. Okay, so you had these Edomites uproot Jake, okay, from these European kingdoms and monarchs, okay, and establish themselves, man. Okay, and as they established themselves, they would begin to what go on conquest. That's why you have Spanish, what they call the conquistadors. Okay, which that means just goes to a conqueror. You see, so these devils, they would begin to rebuild, okay, that Greco-Roman Empire back in the earth. In the Enlightenment age, that's when that Greco-Roman thought and philosophy, all right, and Satanism would really take root in the shadows of this man's government. Okay, but these Edomite Europeans, they went to go forth and they went and colonized the earth. The earth is given into the hand of the wicked. The fatness of the heaven, the fatness of the earth, the dew of heaven. He shall live by the sword, and it began with the European colonization, man. Which America is an offshoot of the British Empire. Which grew into the superpower of this Edomite kingdom. Okay, it said they shall build, but I will throw down, and they shall call them the border of wickedness and the people against whom the Lord had indignation forever. So these devils have built, all right, in Greco-Rome in the earth, and now they're trying to go digital with it and extend their rulership, man. Even replace the Most High with technology. Okay, but no, the Lord has indignation against this devil, and the Lord said they will build, but I will throw down. So we're in a time of throwing down. Okay, we're in a time of that great transition because the earth will be transitioned from Esau unto Jacob. Okay, and that's going to be the last transition of rulership, man. Because after that, Yahweh Shai is going to rule in righteousness forever. Okay, and Lord will we of that governing body, those joint heirs, man. Okay, so let's go from there. I got this video I want to get into. A few things we can get into. Well, let's go here. Uh, let's start here.
It's easy to think that Europe was so successful in taking over the world because they had like better ships or guns or whatever. But when you actually look at the whole story, you see that it was actually just a perfect storm of technology and timing and ideology and religion, of a few key inventions. And what I want to show you in this video is that one of the biggest reasons that Europe was able to take over the world is because of the invention of the modern corporation. A collection of people who don't know each other, but who pool their money together for the same goal: extracting resources from faraway places. So this is part 2 of how Europe stole the world.
Yeah, man. This is where we're gonna see, these major corporations are merging the earth. The devil, he will start a global market, through trade, through the through the oceans. Okay, and we're gonna get into all these things, man. Okay, because you go into a corporation, well, it's a two word. It's really two words. Co going into wit. Okay, and then operations. So it were these rich Edomites cooperating together, okay, and forming these, major enterprises, these global enterprises, and enriching themselves, man. And that's why you have these super elite families in the world, because through, colonization, all right, through slavery, you have these rich, all right, Edomites, work together. They created the stock market during this time, you know, they created bonds and all these particular things, and they enriched themselves, you know, beyond their dreams, man. Okay, so let's fast forward because he's gonna go into a commercial. Well, let's go here, and he's gonna start to get into it.
Catch up on where we are in the story. In part 1, we talked about how Spain and Portugal went out to get in on trade and accidentally ran into a bunch of land they decided was unclaimed, and it turned into a big race to see who could take this. Other Europeans had been dabbling in imperialism, but in the early 1600s, it was time to get serious. The first to follow suit were the Dutch, who were becoming really good at navigating water and making maps and doing business. They decided to follow Portugal's lead and go around the bottom of Africa, stopping right here at the very tip in what today is known as Cape Town, South Africa. They established a permanent colony of white settlers whose descendants would go on to become a major part of South Africa's history. The Dutch used their prime position in Cape Town to restock on their way to Southeast Asia, where they were trading for spices with local empires and claiming serious amounts of land in what is today Indonesia. Around the same time, at the start of the 1600s, we see the next kingdoms trying their hand at large-scale imperialism. Meet the two rookies on the block: England and France, who would go on to actually cause a lot of trouble on the world map, but for now they're just getting started. They, for the most part, followed Spain's lead, going west for the Americas, though England sent ships east at this time as well. Anyway, here in the Americas, they showed up and, like colonizers before them, found lots of land and lots of people living on that land. Kind of inconvenient. These aren't real people, right? They don't actually own this land, you can hear the English people like sort of saying to themselves. So they came up with a new, very useful tool. It was a mental tool. In addition to guns and smallpox and alliances with local tribes that helped them divide and conquer the locals, Europeans also developed a complex set of legal philosophies to convince themselves that these people were not, in fact, capable to claim any land. After all, they were foragers. They didn't farm. They couldn't own this land because they didn't use it for productive means. They were subhuman, or at least non-civilized, so they do not deserve to own property.
And that's BS, man. And that goes into what you call scientific racism. Okay, scientific racism. You see, and they had, certain, doctrines and documents. Okay, like the doctrine and discovery and the Spanish, requirement. Okay, which said that the people on the land, if they wasn't Christian, they were savages. Okay, and this is where you have the birth of plantation Christianity, man. Okay, and then also they were saying that these people were inferior, they wasn't being productive with the land, when that's a goddamn lie, man. You know, that's a complete goddamn lie, and we're gonna show you, man. Okay, so Um, let's go here real quick. All right, let's read this first, and then I'll finish typing this other prompt. Well, let's go here to the chat real quick, because the doctrine that they're speaking of is mainly the doctrine of discovery. Okay, or they're saying that they're discovering these land with these inferior people, so they have a right to the land because the people are not Christians and they're inferior. So that was they claim to the land that the people was inferior. Now, when you go here, uh, goes into the doctrine of discovery and Spanish requirement, which you went over these before. It said the doctrine of discovery and the Spanish requirement were legal and religious concepts used during the European colonization of the Americas to justify claiming indigenous lands and a certain authority over indigenous people. The doctrine of discovery was a legal principle that emerged from a series of 15th century papal decrees from the Roman Catholic Church and was later adopted by several European colonial powers. Its core ideas were Christian European nations could claim sovereignty over lands they discovered if those lands were not already ruled by another Christian monarch. So it doesn't matter that you had whole civilizations on that land already. Okay, whole communities and civilizations of people on their land already. Okay, that didn't matter. If they wasn't a Christian monarch, then that land could be claimed by a Christian monarch. You see, indigenous people were generally recognized as inhabitants, but were often defined, all right, but often denied full sovereignty over their own territories under this doctrine. The doctrine became a justification for European colonization, land seizure, and the expansion of colonial empires. Although it originated in a religious context, versions of the doctrine influenced colonial and later legal systems. In the United States, for example, the Supreme Court relied on it in the 1823 case, John versus say McIntosh, which held that while Native nations had occupancy rights, ultimate title to the land belonged to the federal government through discovery, man. So even in the 1800s, they were still using it to take land, you know? And it says today, many churches, indigenous organizations, and governments have criticized or formally indicated. Now you go to the Spanish requirements. That the Spanish requirement or the Spanish Requerimiento in Spanish was a document drafted by the Spanish crown in 1513. Spanish conquistadors were instructed to read it out loud, often in Spanish, to indigenous communities before taking military action. So they're reading in Spanish to people that don't speak Spanish. You see? Goddamn devil, man. The document stated that the Most High had given authority over the world to the Pope. The Pope had granted Spain authority, and see how these devils use the Bible to rob, steal, and kill. Even to this day, with small hats, the only time they go to the Bible is to justify a genocide. Okay, still the same devils to this day, man. It said the Pope had granted Spain authority over the newly encountered lands. Indigenous people were required to accept Christianity and recognize the authority of Spanish monarchs, man. That's why you have so much Roman Catholicism, okay, in Central and South America, man. And this was nothing but another Hellenization, man. Okay, what the Greeks did to us, during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, man. Okay, it was just on a much broader scale. Okay, so if they refused or resisted, Spain claimed it was justified in waging war, taking property, and enslaving captives. In practice, the requiremento was frequently read under circumstances where indigenous people could not understand it, were not present, or had no realistic opportunity to respond. Many historians, many historians view it as a legal ritual intended to provide a justification for conquest rather than a genuine negotiation. Now, they said that they wasn't farming the land, they weren't being productive with it, but let's just type this in real quick. Let's type this in real quick. Okay, so I'm gonna ask, did the indigenous people, all right, of the Americans have advanced Okay, agriculture and engineering. Let's see, before, all right, the Europeans. All right, let's go here. Yep, showing that there was a goddamn lie. Okay, so when you go into it, it said, yes, it says many indigenous societies in the Americas developed sophisticated agriculture, engineering, architecture, and systems of governance long before Europeans arrived. The level of technological development varied across regions, just as it did in Europe, Africa, and Asia, but many societies achieved, all right, remarkable advances. It says agriculture, indigenous people domesticated and cultivated many crops that became globally important, including corn, potatoes, tomatoes, beans, squash, peppers, cacao, the chocolate, cassava. All right. Some notable agricultural achievements include the Aztec Empire. Farmers built chinampas or floating gardens. These were artificial agricultural islands and shallow lakes that produced high yields and supported the large population of the tech Technotilian, if I'm saying it right. It says Inca Empire farmers constructed extensive terrace fields on steep mountain slopes. The terraces reduce erosion, conserve water, and allow farming at high elevations. Many indigenous communities in what is now the eastern United States practice the Three Sisters method, planting corn, beans, and squash together because the crops supported one another biologically. Engineering. Many indigenous civilizations carried out major engineering projects. The Inca built over 25,000 miles of roads through the Andes, along with rope suspension bridges and sophisticated drainage systems. Machu Picchu was constructed with precisely fitted stone blocks that have withstood centuries of earthquakes without mortar. The city of what's that? Tenochtitlan featured causeways, canals, aqueducts, and flood control systems. When Spanish first saw it in 1519, some compared its size and organization favorably to major European cities. All right, it says Cahoca, near present day St. Louis, was the largest city north of Mexico. Around the 11th century, it contained massive earthwork mounds, organized neighborhoods, and population that may have reached tens of thousands. Architecture says many indigenous people built monumental structures, including the pyramids of the Maya civilization, large ceremonial complexes through Mesoamerica, stone fortresses and cities in the Andes, earthen mounds and plazas in North America. All right, astronomy and mathematics. The Maya civilization developed highly accurate calendars, advanced astronomical observations used for agriculture and religious ceremonies, a sophisticated mathematical system that included the concept of zero independently developed, man. So what the hell is these devils were talking about, man? All right, Jake was highly advanced over here, man. You know, agriculture, engineering, astronomy. They knew, you know, how to read the heavens, for agriculture. And you see a calendar, okay, which that goes back to us, man. Because our calendar was based off the moon, okay, dealing with the new moon. You see, so just wanted to tap into that, man. Because these devils will say any goddamn thing, man. Well, let's go here to let's go back to it.
Very clever, very effective. And so now you see the next layer of ideological thinking that was required for these Europeans to justify their land theft. It was the need to dehumanize the people living on these lands. Here's a letter from a British settler who describes North America as a wilderness, quote, where none inhabit but hellish fiends and brutish men. This dehumanizing paired really well with another ideology that was very popular at the time, Christianity. A religion that told its followers to go out and preach to everyone so that they can be saved. Perfect. We have these unrefined, brutish, fiendish men, and we have Christians who have the power to save them. Anything is possible now. So by the late 1600s, the colonizing project is fully underway. A lot of Europeans are getting...
And this is the Christianity, the vocab, okay, defense, that he travels around the earth, trying to defend. That Christianity. It's the origin of that Christianity. You see? And it's nothing but Edomite supremacy.
In on this, but here are the major players. You've got Spain and Portugal, the OGs, and then you've got the Netherlands, France, and England. We need to make one thing clear, that the major reason why these European empires were so successful so quickly was because they were really the first to start trading by sea in the Western Hemisphere. So while Jesus and saving and whatever was a big part of the justification of Europeans going out and feeling entitled to take land, he became less and less of a part of the picture, especially for the Dutch, who basically were just like, who cares about Jesus? We want profit. And this is the next phase of the story of how Europe took over the world. We'll call this chapter Private Empire. And frankly, it's one of the most important things to know about this history. Remember that European imperialism started as a desire for trade, to trade with big empires in the East. Then, surprise, we found all this land, we'll call it unclaimed, and we'll start claiming it while dehumanizing the natives in the process. Remember, okay? A lot of that was funded by governments, like kings and stuff. But eventually, the citizens themselves of these places realized that they could make a business out of this. And again, this is where the Dutch wrote the blueprint. So now just get together a bunch of people and form a corporation, like the first corporation ever, the Dutch East India Company, which would fund private voyages. And you, a random Dutch person in the 1600s, could buy this share, a little portion of that company, to get in on a little bit of the profits. But if the profits are big enough, then everyone wins. Welcome to the era of corporations. So now you have the Dutch with their new Kickstarter campaign, crowdfunding their private empire, totally exceeding their goal. And these Dutch...
And this is how the elites started to bypass, governments, by coming together, these oligarchs. This is how the oligarchs really, shot past the governments by coming together amongst one another, and financing these certain ventures, and getting all the profits. To the point to where these governments, started to come to them. Because you go into, around the 1800s, these corporations is building governments out, man. Out of debt. The governments had to start to borrow from the corporations. And it was the Dutch, company, that laid the blueprint for capitalism and started the stock market, and this was done by the Orange family. You go into the root of the Dutch British, corporation. You see, it was started by the family of Orange from the Netherlands. And they laid the blueprint that these elite bankers follow today as for how corporations are able to extrapolate, the world's wealth. By funding these ventures, you see, of stealing resources, and slavery. Let's play this.
Dutch corporate sailors set out on the tried and true routes that they already knew, arriving to Indonesia, where they showed up not to convert people to Jesus necessarily, but to harvest cloves and peppers as efficiently as possible, and to come home and to sell them for a profit and fatten the pockets of the shareholders who funded the whole journey. This isn't like a surprising novel model to us today, because this is how the world runs. But at this point, this was a new invention. Oh, and the government secretly loved this. They could give the company some military power, kind of ignore the details of exactly how it was all going down, and still ensure that their country got in on the world's riches. And these corporations leveled up really quickly and became basically little private empires with the ability to take over land, build bases, and establish relationships with locals. Not for the prestige of like a king, but so that they could make more money for their shareholders. It was the private investors who helped them get really big, really fast, all through this invention of the publicly traded company. And again, it all started with the Dutch East India Company. And just like any startup, they were more nimble than the clunky old government. They had good funding, they were private, they were fast, they had an ability to undercut competition. All of this allowed them to dominate this region when it came to taking over land, harvesting stuff, and bringing it back to Europe. And because they were the best operators, they eventually became the kingpins of all spice trade in Europe. Things like black pepper, nutmeg, cloves. All of this because of the countless trips that they were taking between the East Indies and Amsterdam. Okay, but it wasn't just the Dutch. The British also got in on this private empire idea. Let's see here. This map. It's the map of all of the British private companies and their spheres of influence. The government doesn't own these places. This is like government supported, but by and large, private companies. Profit-seeking businessmen looking for stuff that they couldn't get in their own country, going out and finding places where they could. Over here in North America, you have the Virginia Company, who's like going hardcore on tobacco, and then its sister company, the Plymouth Company. One was funded by a bunch of Londoners, and the other, the Plymouth Company, funded by a bunch of rich dudes in Plymouth, England. Their job was to colonize land and to build a business in the New World. And then if you look over here in the East, you see the British East India Company, who got really good at taking over giant amounts of land in India. The French were doing the same thing. They had their own West India Company that was colonizing the Caribbean to grow and sell sugar, and many, many more. Private empire was such a powerful accelerant to imperialism because it got all of these private empires to compete with each other and to get better and more efficient and to practice their conquests, repetition, fueled by profit-seeking people. They developed amazing skills and they drew maps. A lot of beautiful, beautiful maps. As a map nerd, this is where I start to like perk up. I notice around this time, like sort of late 1600s and then the 1700s, European maps start to fill out with more detail, with more accuracy. Because after all, the more you can depict on paper, the better blueprint you have to conquer land and exploit it. So by the 1700s, Europe is now a different world than what you saw in the 1400s. You start to see kings living in insane excess, tea and coffee and chocolate and tobacco and sugar. They have access to so much stuff. And perhaps most significantly, it wasn't just for the ultra rich, it was a new middle class, the mercantile class of merchants who were getting rich off of all of this new commerce. There was suddenly abundance. And with abundance comes time. Time to sit around and think about art and science, all while sipping on coffee harvested from faraway lands, stimulating these European brains to invent new ways of measuring things, to observe the world, the stars, to manipulate nature to make life better. And the competition between these private empires just grew. And like with any profit-seeking competition, these companies needed to keep leveling up how much wealth they could extract from these places, how much land they could take over to meet demand back home. Until eventually they turned full on to the most horrific version of profit-seeking imperialism. Stealing millions of people from, most notably here in West Africa, taking them to their new colonies and forcing them to work. Stealing and trading humans and forcing them to work was not anything new to this continent. Islamic and African slave traders have been doing this for a very long time. But it was here in the 1700s, in this context of private empire, that things really start to pick up. As these European empires, mostly England, Portugal, and France, took it to a new level to fuel their highly optimized, shareholder fueled private empires. So optimized that the slave trade itself was outsourced to a private company, at least in the case of England. It was imperial profit seeking efficiency at its finest and most horrifying. You can almost hear the glee and greed in the voice of one English slave trader who wrote, quote, "What a glorious and advantageous trade this is. It is the hinge on which all the trade of this globe moves." But you
And all this can be explained in prophecy, okay? Because this will happen to a nation of people for disobedience. You know, this captivity was prophesied to happen, okay, to us as a people for disobedience, and it happened. Showing you how you can explain history with prophecy that's already passed. Okay, so first let's start here. Deuteronomy 28 and 15. Okay, it says, "But it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of the Lord, Yahweh by Shem outside thy power, to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes, which I have commanded thee this day, then all these curses shall come upon thee and overtake thee." Okay, so part of our curse was this captivity, and this slave trade was a part, of the curses. You see, this slave trade that they're speaking of, in which these European corporations and governments enrich themselves off the labor, okay, of the tribes, man. Okay, and you go here to verse 68, and the Lords shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships. Okay, and it's not speaking of ancient Egypt; it's talking about spiritual Egypt, which is America. Okay, because Egypt goes into the house of bondage as well. Okay, it says, "By the way whereof I spake unto thee, thou shalt see it no more, and there ye shall be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you." Okay, and no man shall buy you, which means that we wouldn't be redeemed out of this captivity. Okay, and no man would be able to do it. It would take Yahweh Shai, which Yahweh Shai said, "Well, he's not coming to meet." Okay, these devils as a man. He came as a man during the pagan Roman Empire to be a sacrifice. But when Yahweh Shai comes to redeem, okay, the word buy goes into redeem. Okay, matter of fact, let's just get that word. Okay, I ain't looked at it in a while. I don't think it's changed. But when you go into the word buy, yep, it's the same word, quanah, in the Hebrew, which when you go into it, it says what? To get, to acquire, because vocab would say, well, it said no man shall buy you. Y'all was bought. So this, shut up. How dumb can you be? Okay, who gonna put slaves on a slave ship, ship them off, all right, on a 2-3 month voyage, which costs money, okay, and they not be sold, okay? No, man, it's speaking of here. It says of the Most High, originating, creating, redeeming His people. Okay, so the Lord has left us in this captivity for a long time, and we wasn't redeemed. He had settled with no man, will be born amongst our people that will redeem us out their captivity. No, we will have to wait on Yahweh Shai to come from the heavens. You see, of the Most High originating, creating, redeeming His people. Okay, so when you go from there, the Middle Passage, from Africa across the Atlantic, all these things was prophesied. When you go to Isaiah 22, okay, and 18, Isaiah 22 and 18 says, uh, let's see if I want to start at 17. Yeah, it says, "Behold, the Lord will carry thee away with a mighty captivity and will surely cover thee." Because even though the Lord sent us into captivity, He made sure that, we endured and that a remnant will be preserved, through all these captivities, man. Okay? And it says, "He will surely violently turn and toss thee like a ball into a large country," that's in that boat. Okay? Tossing to and fro violently, which a lot of our people died on the trip over here, man. It said, "There shalt thou die in America." Okay? That large country is America, and there the chariots of thy glory shall be the shame of thy Lord's house, man. Which our people, you sing them songs about the chariots from the cotton fields, the fields of work. Okay, and we was in a position to change and of shame, showing that our people seen no chariots, man, from their positions of shame. Okay, but this is speaking that middle passage that's being tossed like a ball violently into a large country of America, man. Okay, where we would die, come back in captivity, man, into this last reincarnation. Okay, so these devils, they just looked at it as profit, but that was a captivity, okay, spoken of, man. You see, and these devils, they boasted in there. That's why you go here to, these devils got rich beyond what they can imagine with all their free labor and having, all this and establishing a global trade, and having these corporations, okay, these mega corporations that will become these monopolies, okay, to where they can set their prices, you know, and they just got crazy rich. Now, when you go to Zechariah 11:5, what does it say? Possessors slay them and hold themselves not guilty, and they that sell them say, "Blessed be the Lord, for I am rich." This is Esau. Okay, blessed be the Lord, for I am rich, and their own shepherds pity them not. Because you had Jake selling Jake into captivity. You had the northern tribes warring against each other. You know, on side of the Edomites. Okay, so this devil, because he was able to come in. These corporations came in, with this money. They bought a lot of Jake out, man. Jake turned against each other. Okay, so they didn't look at themselves as being guilty. What they had, the doctrine of discovery. Okay, the Spanish requirement. Look, if you're not a Christian, okay, and because you people are inferior, you're not a Christian monarch. Well, the land's not yours. Okay, and because you're not a Christian, well, you need guidance. You need a master because you're not a Christian. Okay, they saying, look, God gave the world to the Pope, so we have authority from the Pope to come and conquer. You see, so they had all these doctrines where they held themselves not guilty, man. Okay, so let's play a little bit more, and then we get ready to close out in a minute. So let's play a little more of this.
Europeans are starting to become really enlightened at this point, right? Like they're starting to think through like human rights. Yes, but remember that.
Go back. Come on, now tighten up.
Globe moves. But Europeans are starting to become really enlightened at this point, right? Like they're starting to think through like human rights and like equality and starting to lay the groundwork for like democracy. Yes, but remember that these Europeans had ideas in their minds that were planted hundreds of years earlier. Ideas that allowed them to invent things like the New World and unclaimed land that actually belonged to them. They applied a lot of those same ideas to the slave trade. A lack of Jesus, a lack of white European culture and technology, making these people inferior, in need of saviors to make use of their land, their resources, and their bodies. Okay, but let's just be clear about what's happening here. Yes, this is about profit. Yes, this is about ideology. But this part is so damn important to me because this is the foundation upon which our modern world is built. In this moment, these empires were actually building structures in our minds. Structures that define who has power, who is worth something, who gets resources, who is permitted to lead, to exploit, to benefit. These structures were defined by force, by profit, by greed, and they totally worked. They put Europeans on top, giving them the prosperity and resources to fuel scientific, cultural, and political revolutions that allowed them to keep holding on to that power, to keep exerting domination over others. Okay, yeah, I get it. Half of you just had like a conniption because of this like woke sermon that you just got from me. That's not what this is, okay? I'm trying to look at the history and tie it to today, how all of us live in a world that was built off of what happened during this time, the ideas, the movement of people that happened because of this private empire. That's not the woke mob. That's just like, what happened? Sorry. Even after the British people here on the east coast of North America wanted to break away from England and start their own country where, quote, all men are created equal, they still couldn't throw off the thirst for profits that slavery brought them. These structures were way too firm, so they kept doing it. The momentum of private empire was too great to slow down, at least not without a bloody war that almost ripped this young nation apart. So that's private empire, a huge part of Europe's ability to take over land on the map and reshape the world. In part 3 of this series, which is going to be the final part, I'm going to tell you what happens next when these powers reach every part of the globe, establishing an order that they control. How we talk, how we do our politics, how we trade, including some really good positive things that have made the world better. It's an order that was shaped by these forces of European imperialism. And it's an order that still shapes all of us today.
Yeah, man. So that Renaissance period is when Esau came into his birthright. The fatness of the earth to do a heaven, okay? And he would do it by what? The sword, okay? The scripture speak about how he would go through the four quarters of the earth to deceive, so through deception, through the sword, okay? Through this man getting all this wealth, he would run the world. You see? Now I want to go here. Psalms is devil up. All right. So let's go here to the book of Ezekiel 28. Let's see. This is the book of Ezekiel 28. Okay, in verse I started at 1. It said, the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, say unto the prince of Tyrus, thus said the Lord power, because thine heart is lifted up, and thou hast said, I am a God. I sit in the seat, okay, of God in the midst of the seas, yet thou art a man and not God, though thou set thine heart as the heart of God. And see, Esau, Edom, which we know there was a real prince of Tyrus, that was proud, and wealthy, okay? But you have to understand in the spirit, this is Esau because Esau has done it like no other nation. You see, because the prince of Tyrus didn't have control of world trade, the world wealth, you know, to where this man had created a system to where he can print wealth, man. And these corporations, this small percentage of Edomites own everything, man. Esau done it on a whole nother level than the prince of Tyrus of this time, man. Okay. Ezekiel 28:3 said, Behold, thou art wiser than Daniel. There is no secret they can hide from thee. So not only did he get raw resources, and then he had to sword the military might, to conquer lands and enslave people. But then, technology took off, so this devil was able to tap in on a whole nother level, when you put technology with the sword, man. You see, it says, with thy wisdom and with thy understanding, thou hast gotten thee riches and has gotten gold and silver into thy treasures. By thy great wisdom and by traffic, yeah, this whole stock market thing where people can buy in on these companies. So what this devil, he's flipping other people's money. He's making people take the risk with him. Okay, and he's able, to fund his corporations off other people's money. You see, with this whole stock market thing. Then he's able to manipulate the stocks. He's been doing that for forever. So man, he has a very wicked, crafty, economy where all the wealth trickles to him. Okay, and everyone is tricked into what being debt slaves. Okay, it says, by the great wisdom and by traffic thou hast increased thy riches, and thy heart is lifted up because of thy riches. Therefore, thus said the Lord power, because thou hast set thine heart as the heart of the Most High. Because now Esau thinks he's a god. He thinks he's on the tier of godhood. He thinks that he can now step into, all right, the shoes of the Most High, okay, because of wealth, technology, influence, witchcraft, military, you know, you see, but he's deceived. It said, behold, therefore I will bring strangers upon thee, the terrible of nations, and they shall draw their swords against the beauty of thy wisdom, and they shall defile thy brightness. And that's what we're seeing now. These heathen nations, the Lord have empowered them with the sword. Okay, and Esau's being embarrassed, man. And it's the Lord showing that you ain't no God. I made you, and I'm finna break you down. Okay, and this is what we're seeing play out real time. Because Esau done had a hell of a run. Okay, but now he's at his end. You see, it says, they shall bring thee down to the pit, and thou shalt die the deaths of them that are slain in the midst of the seas. Okay, with just a very dishonorable death when you die at sea. You know, that's a dishonorable death. Because when you go into the different translations, you go into the Bible, think the NLT, what was the AMP? One of them. It might have been the next verse, you know. But when you go into dying at the sea, that's a dishonorable death, you know. And Esau, he's gonna be embarrassed, you know, on his way out. You know, being removed from power, the Lord's gonna do it in a very dishonorable fashion. Okay, 28 and 9, I think it's verse 10. It says, without yet say before he that slaved thee, I'm a God. Yo, Esau can die, man. How you a God? Okay, you niggas be doing heart transplants, niggas be dying of old age, niggas age get wrinkled. Okay, nigga, you know them niggas be taking hella naps. Old ass niggas, man. Okay, it says, but thou shalt be a man and no God in the hand of him that slaved thee, man. Okay, it says, thou shalt die the deaths of the uncircumcised by the hand of strangers, for I have spoken and said the Lord power. And when you go into I think it was this one, verse 10. Okay, the Lord finna give this man a very dishonorable, all right, departure, man. You know, he's gonna be removed from power in a very uh, dishonorable way. Okay, embarrassing fashion. You know, and a lot of these devils, okay, you know, they're finna die, okay, by judgment, man. You know, a lot of you Edomites finna get judged, man. Okay, but when you go here, let me go to the Bible, so like, when you go into the Bible, okay, it says, NLT said, you will die like an outcast at the hands of foreigners. I, the sovereign Lord, all right, has spoken it. You see, they will die like an outcast, man. You see, you know why he's parading himself like he's some god, you know, because I say he's had a hell of a run, okay, but now that run has come to an end. You see, but yeah, just want to tap into their history, man, dealing with the devil. You know, I thought that was pretty informative. You know, straight to the point video. So Lord will, you know, you brothers, all right, and you few sisters edified. Till next time, I say Shalom, call me Ashala, a Bible, soon. Shalom.